So today we're going to start with a little safety moment, and it's important that many of us, because we're still working from home and we're in this new work environment, typically slips, trips, and falls are very common in the workplace. Well, now our workplace is at home. You may be working at your kitchen table, at the living room table, maybe in your closet. I'm not sure where you're working, but it's a new environment. So be aware of the people in your environment. You've got maybe animals, kids, spouses, roommates. Make sure that you're aware of what's going on around you in this new work environment, and avoid distractions. So you might be on a work call and you're going to the refrigerator to get something. Make sure when you're multitasking, you're paying attention to what's going on around you, and be careful of those hazards. Make sure your work area is well lit, and electrical cords, even computer cords, printer cords if you have them. Make sure they are secured, not only for yourself, but the people around you. Clean up any spills or fallen objects immediately. This is where I want to talk about how my own personal story is that my mother used to set traps for my dad, and you could hear him across the house saying, "Joyce, you set another trap for me." So what she would do, she would go in the kitchen and she would pull out a drawer, and she'd leave the drawer open. She'd open a cupboard and not close it after she's taken the item out. Then my dad would come along and run into it, hit his head, whatever, and you could hear him saying, "Joyce, you left me another trap." So when I thought about this safety moment, I wanted to share something that I always remember that my dad said, stop setting traps. So the message today is to be aware around the house in your new working environment, and don't set traps for the people in your home as well as yourself. If you forget you've dropped something, etc., take care of it right away. So that's the safety moment today. I want to remind you that we do encourage feedback from our stakeholders. If you go to portlandgeneral.com/IRP, you will find this box here it's telling you we want your feedback. And by clicking on that box, you will find a form. And what's important about this form, there's a box there to check if you would like your question and our answers, your comments shared online. You can still ask questions by sending them to our IRP mailbox. However, we will not be publishing that content on our website. If you want your comments as well as your questions answered and those answers shared online, this is the form you would use, and click that box to give us permission to publish online. And then you will find a PDF. We're going to compile all the comments, questions, and answers and put them out under this category, previous IRP meetings, where you're going to see the video of this meeting. You'll see the prior month's comments, questions, and answers. So now I would like to turn the session over to Seth to introduce our topic. Seth.
Thanks, Ann. Thank you all for being here. I just wanted to say before we get started today, the purpose of the safety moment, just so we're all clear on this, it's important to remember that PG is a company of around 3,000 people, and most of them are working on physical infrastructure. And so while we are all at this meeting mostly office workers, where the risks are relatively lower, the safety moment is a part of PG's culture, reflecting that the consequences of safety are very real. And so that's why we do it in these meetings. We think it's an important tradition to continue to always have a safety moment, so that A, there's valuable information, and probably much more importantly, B, it connects us to the rest of the company, where safety is a very large concern when we're working with our physical infrastructure. So that's why we do it, and we will continue to do it. Hopefully there's value in both of those purposes. So thank you, Ann, for leading us through that today. And as Ann said, she is a new addition to a team, and she's doing a great job. We're thrilled to have her, and so she's going to be leading us through this meeting, and hopefully it goes smoothly. So for today, we're talking about just one topic, and it's not an IRP topic, though they're in the Venn diagram between the UM 1728 settlement and the IRP, there's clear overlap, which we'll get to plenty in this discussion. But we're focusing today specifically on this UM 1728 settlement, which we came to an agreement with parties last year during the UM 1728 docket. So if you can go to the first slide, I can go into that. And for my presentation, stop me anytime, but this will be brief. So last year, the commission order outlined a settlement reached by PGE and parties in which we came to an agreement on the contentious issues of that docket. And part of that settlement was that in an IRP roundtable, there would be a specific set of analyses that PGE's IRP team would conduct and present to parties. Now, part of that stipulation was that we would send the materials out a few weeks before, which we did. And today we're trying to discuss those results. So that was in June when the order came out. The settlement was reached by parties a month or two before. And then in November, the commission approved PGE's request for an extension of the IRP. And so in that November meeting, we discussed with parties about the timing, because in the stipulation, we said this material would come out before the IRP, the next IRP, then scheduled for March of 2022 to be presented. And so we wanted to make sure that we satisfied parties' desire to see this information by that time. And so, again, we're devoting this meeting to that purpose, to present the results of this analysis. So it's important to remember that this is a modeling exercise, and it's for informational purposes. And the purpose of this meeting is to discuss these changes and answer any questions that you have about the analysis. If you can go to the next slide, Anne. Thank you. So this is copy and paste directly from that agreement that we reached with parties. Edited just for clarity about the specific parts of these sensitivities, the things that were included. This is really just for reference, just so we can go back to say that, and in the materials, you can go back and say that we are meeting the stipulation as outlined here. So there's nothing really to discuss on this slide, just that these are the things in which we agreed and that we are going to present. If there is a question. Irene, go ahead.
Thanks, Seth. Can you explain from a big picture how you kind of estimated how many QFs might come online and how many QFs might renew? Looks like we're going to go through each of the elements, but can you describe how they all fit together in terms of getting an end result estimate?
I sure cannot. We have an expert here who can and who will. So if your question's not completely answered in the next 30 minutes, definitely ask it again. But Corey has a great handle on this, and she's going to walk us through that entire question. There's a lot there, and she's the best to answer.
Thank you.
Okay. With that, I will turn it to Corey. Corey, go ahead.
Yeah, Irene, hopefully I answer your question, but yeah, definitely ask it again. So for those that don't know me, I'm Corey Medicon. I work in PG structuring and origination group. I'm the commercial lead, at least have been for the last about 18 months or so. handling QF contracts. Next slide. So just a quick item to note, all of the data that you're going to see here related to QFs on these following slides is from a snapshot that we did on January 6th, 2022. So as requested in the first part of the stipulation, parties requested that we review 6 different attributes that will be outlined on these following slides for our QFs that have executed contracts but are not yet operational at the time of the snapshot. So the data you're seeing on this slide is just a summary of those contracts. So right now we have 18 projects in our queue for about 365 megawatts that have executed PPAs, not yet online. Next slide. The first item in the stipulation that was requested was to look at the historical percentage of QFs having reached commercial operation. So I did that. I broke it down by technology type. To no surprise, most of our QFs are solar. So I did a success rate by all of our technologies combined. So you can see we have 68 online compared to a total of 137, as opposed to solar, which we have 60 and 123. So really close to the same percentage of success rates across all technologies and solar, but slightly lower. And so, like I said, again, data as of January 6th. And the only thing I want to caveat on the terminated data is I did not include QFs that we had terminations because they transferred to our community solar program. Next slide. I went ahead and I broke down that success rate on the overall technologies a little bit further. That 50%, and what we're looking at here is essentially success rate by contract execution year. So for example, contracts that PPAs executed in 2010, those had a success rate of 100% coming online. And so we can see that the success rate differs pretty significantly year to year, and that there are obviously several elements that can affect any one of these years: number of contracts executed in that year, number of developers holding those contracts, on-off system. There are a lot of elements. So that is one of the reasons we treat QFs like any other bilateral, in that we do frequent updates, snapshot updates, because it is hard to predict the success. And just as like an example, we see 2018 has a pretty low success rate, 36%. But if you dive into that just like a little further, there's many elements to this data, but just as an example, in 2018, we had one developer alone that had 11 contracts that terminated. And if you were to have like excluded that one developer, that would have brought the success rate back up to 50%. So I just wanted to give that as an example, but I saw a hand, I think it's Irene.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. When looking at QFs that have reached their COD or not, are you looking at only new QFs, or are you looking at operational QFs? For example, where would an operational QF that enters into a contract with PGE be counted? Would they be counted in this, or are they kind of in a separate bucket?
They are counted in this. We don't have a bunch of them. I can follow up with the exact number of QFs that we had that were essentially existing facilities. So, you know, they're contracted, they're already online type of thing. It does include these percentages, but we don't have like a bunch of those per se, but it is in this count.
Thank you. And in looking at the annual success rate, appreciate the explanation about why they might be greater or lower depending on the number of projects. Were there any other factors that you potentially identified as reasons why there might be annual differences?
The biggest one that I honed in on just looking at the data really was around the concentration within a developer. There are other elements, obviously, that can lead to this around, and there are items in the stipulation we'll kind of talk about on some other slides around interconnect and other items like that. But one of the biggest trends that I saw in the data was really around the concentration with developers.
Thanks.
Corey, can you hear
And
me? I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm on the phone, so I can't see the screen.
yeah, one more follow-up question, and don't necessarily take these questions as challenging, just trying to understand why. So you said that you excluded the community solar QFs from the success rate. I could see that maybe because they still haven't, they still may become commercially operational, or can you just provide a little background as to why that decision was made? What sort of reasons you were thinking about?
Yeah, and just to clarify, I exclude, well, all this data excludes community solar contracts, but I more meant it from the termination perspective, because we had a lot of our community solar program facilities were originally contracted as QFs with us, and so they essentially terminated their QF contract and then went to our community solar program. And so I didn't include anything related to community solar. So if it had been like classified as terminated, but really it was just a transfer to community solar, I didn't consider that a terminated contract, as opposed to not achieving COD. But to your point, none of my data here involves community solar.
Great, thanks for explaining that.
Yeah, hey Corey, Jake Stevens, Nissan. Sorry, I couldn't get the online interface to work this morning on the phone, but yeah, a couple of similar questions. In terms of these different years, can you comment on like the number of contracts and number of megawatts? You know, in 2010, was there one contract or zero? I'm presuming that, I don't know how you're representing if there were zero contracts in a given year. I guess maybe that's 2011, which is not presented, but just in terms of scaling what that is, and generally, I guess throughout the rest of the discussion, that would be helpful wherever possible. And then also related to that, I guess, wanted to understand how you're dealing with contracts. I guess if there were things signed in 2020, you're showing 100% success rate, that would be pretty fast. So I guess I'm wondering if there's cases where some earlier executed contract was then amended or changed or something, or if those are really new contracts genuinely that then came online. Thanks.
Yeah, to your first question, Jake, about the number of contracts in each of these buckets, maybe I'll just give you a range, because we'll walk through them all, be kind of a lot. But to your point, yeah, 2011, there were no contracts executed. That's why you don't see that year represented here. And in terms of how many contracts in a year, like our lowest, for example, is like, that's what I mean. It fluctuates a lot. So like in 2012, for example, it was just one contract, it came online. And that's why I mentioned in 2018, totally different world. We had 42 projects signed PPAs. So it's very fluctuating year to year of like how much QF activity we're seeing. We can give the breakdown further, we can follow up, but it is a very wide range. And to your comment of like 2020, it kind of goes back to Irene's question of, does this include QFs that are essentially already online in the sense of they're already existing facilities? And that answer was yes. So like in 2020, the reason you see 100% is because it's an existing facility.
Okay, yeah, and I guess I was thinking more of cases where whether that was like a new contract that had been signed for a new facility, not a renewal type variation. But yeah, it'd be great if the sort of number of PPAs and megawatts could be provided, if you guys revisited these at all. And then looking at like 2018 and 19, where you have projects have 4 years to come online, and so you're showing success rates less than 100%. I'm curious how you're dealing with the representation of facilities that still have more time to come online, as calling it a success rate or not. Are you calling something that isn't online yet but still has another year failure in this presentation, or is that counted as a discussed or just omitted?
If the facility is under contract and is still working to come online, whether or not it's in its 3 years or it's in its 1-year cure, then it's not counted in here at all. It's because these are ones that either straight are online now or are straight terminated. So in your example of it's like still trying to achieve COD, it would have been included. You're not seeing the slides, but it was essentially on that first slide I showed that of QFs that have executed contracts that have not yet achieved commercial operation. But that would not be included in the table you're seeing here because they're not online, nor have they been terminated.
Okay, thanks. Final question on that. Are you counting contracts where you guys have issued a notice of termination as failed, or if that's still being disputed, how are you presenting that?
They're considered terminated for the purposes of this data. Irene, did you have a follow-up or is your hand just still up?
Yeah, I had a follow-up, just trying to make sure I understand it. So if you have a project that signs a contract that's not yet selling to PGE, and then it comes online, that would count as a project that adds into the percentage that would, if there's one project in 1 year, that'd be 100%. Are those, for this category, are those only new projects to PGE, or are renewals of projects that are already selling to PGE included here?
So we will get into the renewals. That was the second part of the stipulation. But the sneak peek to that is QF PGE does not have a history of QF renewals with existing facilities who the previous contracting utility was PGE. We do have 2 contracts with QFs that were previously contracted with a different utility that then came to PGE for essentially their renewal. But we don't have any history of QF renewals with our own QFs, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, we could talk more about that in the next one. I just wanted to understand whether or not, if there were any projects that were selling to PGE, whether they were counted as part of the percentage or not. And it sounds like they're not, which is a helpful understanding. So thank you.
Okay, I think we can go to the next slide. Yeah. Okay, the next item in the stipulation asks us to look at opportunities to sell to other utilities. And this is kind of vanilla, but QFs can choose to sell to really any utility so long as they can obtain the appropriate transmission as required by that utility to wheel. And so I just went ahead and I took a look at who the interconnecting provider was for our QF contracts, whether they're online or terminated or waiting to come online. So it's looking at all of them. And you can see the majority of our QFs do interconnect on system to PGE, about 80% of them. And the other 20% are off system, primarily connecting to Bonneville. But we do have a handful who have interconnected to PAC and still sold to PGE, which I think that's like the best example of, they're interconnecting to another utility, but still choose to, wheel into PGE and sell to us as their offtake. Irene?
Yeah, thanks. So under this factor, I think this makes, I think this makes a lot of sense looking at whether or not they're connected to another utility. Did you look at other specific facts in analyzing this factor, or was the analysis on only the issue of whether or not they're interconnected to another utility?
Whether or not they're interconnected to another utility.
Thanks.
Okay, go ahead to the next slide. Next item on the stipulation asked about the sophistication and experience of our project developers. Again, I'm focused here, stipulation talking about QF contracts that are executed not online. So looking at those 18 projects that I mentioned on the first slide. So of the 365 megawatts in that through those 18 contracts, about 90% of those megawatts are held with just 3 developers, all of which PGE would consider highly experienced. And that is due to the fact that all of them have either projects that are proposed or have already been constructed, ranging in a total portfolio of 2,000 to 8,800 megawatts, some of which are across a national footprint. So we don't generally consider that to be a mom and pop shop when you have that volume of projects in your queue. So we would consider the developers in our queue to be pretty sophisticated. Irene?
Yeah, thanks. I guess this kind of goes back to my earlier question to Seth, which is, can you, for each of these items, provide a little more background or nuance or explanation regarding how this factor impacts the overall estimate of the success rate for projects? I mean, like, you could include one factor as being, 80% of that assumption, or each one weighted equally. How are you looking at the importance of each of these factors in terms of determining the success rate for a qualifying facility?
I can try and answer that too. I should make sure I'm understanding your question, Irene, in terms of so the success rates was the first thing we saw, which is a very vanilla look of the data, right? Like, executed, did it achieve COD or not? And I think your question is asking, how are we considering these elements impacting that success rate? Is that right?
Yes. So my understanding of what we're looking for overall in the end result is to get, for PGE's IRP and other purposes, a reasonable estimate of how many qualifying facilities that enter into a contract ultimately come online. And then these are a list of non-exhaustive factors to figure that out. So I'm wondering, how are you weighing the importance of each of these factors? Because some could be really important and some could be not so important.
Yeah, maybe let's wait till the very end when we outline, hold on to that, Irene, if I forget. At the end of my section, I'm going to set up and talk about the sensitivities that we ran from an ELCC perspective related to this data. So let me get there and maybe see if we can answer it then, if that sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. Because I think the numbers in front of us will help.
Well, and following up on that, we're talking about the QF contracts executed but not online yet, right? I guess that's being presented. It comes across as if these experienced people are failing, but is not online actually failed, or is that just they're still in their contract period and still have time to come online?
Yeah, the second. It's not that they're failed. These are just the ones that are executed and are still have their either 3 years to achieve COD or they're still in their cure. So it's not that they're not successful, they just are in their time frame to come online.
Okay. Yeah, that narrative or slide sort of comes across as the former, not the latter. Thanks.
Yeah. Next slide, Ann. Again, so the next item in the stipulation asks us to look at contractual provisions of our QFs. So I think most of the people in this audience know we have really 2 types of contracts, which is our standard, which are defined by our form templates. They're available on our website, and our negotiated contracts. So generally our Schedule 202 or our larger contracts. which vary, the terms and conditions of which vary by PPA and negotiation and are subject to NDA. So I wanted to break down really how much contracting does PGE do with these two types. So you can kind of see the variety that we have. Obviously, most of our contracts are standard, but we are trending, as you can tell, based on that 4 in our executed not yet online, which are going to be our more recently executed contracts. We have 4 that are negotiated to 14 that are standard. And then online, we have 1 negotiated contract online in 67 standard. Irene?
Thanks, Corey. In terms of the terminated contracts that are negotiated, were those terminated completely in terms of those projects they're not expected to come online, or were they similar to community solar where they might have been transferred into a different type of contract?
Terminated altogether. They're not community solar type.
But they weren't like starting off as a QF contract and then negotiate and turn into a bilateral contract or something like that.
Corey, this is Erin Epperson. I just wanted to step in and make sure that we're being mindful of kind of any confidentiality issues that we potentially could be stepping into here before we answer that question.
Yeah. I think this is very much public.
If you need to check and see if it's confidential and then get back and provide information under the cover of a protective order, that's fine. I don't want you to accidentally reveal any confidential information.
Okay. We'll get back to you. I'll circle up with Erin.
Thanks, Corey.
And then you looked at the 2 factors of standard and negotiated. Did you look at any, I assume not, since there's not very many of them, but at particular differences in contract provisions under the negotiated?
No, mostly because even if I did, because of the confidentiality in those agreements, I wouldn't really be able to share that data here anyway.
You wouldn't be able to share the data on the contract terms themselves?
Yeah.
Okay, well, the PGE has made at least a couple of the contracts completely available publicly. But I'm not saying I'm not trying to say that you should have done that, because there's not a lot of negotiated contracts, but just to put a pin that at least a couple of the large negotiated QF contracts are publicly available, which is half of the 4.
Yeah, let me circle back on that. I don't think any of them are. PAC does do theirs. Well, they fully disclose their contracts. We do a summary of our contracts for 202s when we do our filings. Our 201s are fully filed. The full PPAs are filed for those, but not the negotiated. We do summaries. Unless they're available elsewhere and I'm not aware. So let me take a look.
Yeah, at least a couple of them were made available in FERC filings.
This is Erin Epperson. Let's maybe what we could do, because Irene, I appreciate asking the questions, but we obviously want to be mindful of confidentiality issues. So perhaps what we could do is kind of take down, without wading into confidentiality issues on this call and being mindful of time on what we can accomplish here, we could maybe take down kind of what you're looking for here and follow up. So actually, along those lines, Corey, would it be useful for you to, if we kind of, Irene, were able to provide a summary of what information that he's asking about that would be helpful, or do you feel like you got a good handle of that?
I think that Corey's answered the initial question I had. I just wanted to probe a little more on the availability of the contracts, but the substantive question, Corey's answered that. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Okay. I think we can go to the next slide. The next attribute in the stipulation just listed a breakdown for technology. So again, I don't think any of these numbers are going to be surprising to anyone. So I summarized it in two ways. On the left, we see a summary of technology type by megawatts, and on the right, same population, just summarized by number of projects. So once again, solar being the predominant technology that we have in our QF portfolio. But you can see we definitely have a trend that's happening. We have 60 online solar projects that make up, 272 megawatts, as opposed to 16 solar contracts in our queue that are making up 350 megawatts. So we are trending to generally larger QF contracts. And again, you kind of saw it on the last slide as well, more forward negotiated, which are going to be our scheduled 202s, which places even more importance on these projects and in achieving COD, because they are used in our planning purposes. So the technology, questions? Nothing exciting here. Next slide. The next item on the stipulation had to do with interconnection risk. And so what I went and did, I think we're all pretty aware, interconnection risk has a million variables to it and is going to depend on where you're siting, where you are in the queue. There are a lot of things that can affect this. So it's kind of hard to look at it on a higher level perspective. So I looked at it in two ways. I obviously bifurcated the risk from on system to off system. And on the left, I basically looked at what was the success rate based on where you interconnected of achieving COD from your PPA execution within 3 years or less, which is our standard contract time. So we can see our on-system QFs had a higher success rate in that time frame generally than our off-system. And then similarly, the average time between a PPA execution and COD, so both less than 3 years, but we got about 2.5 for our on-system and 2.85 for our off-system. So obviously it's also looking at just contracts that actually achieved commercial operations, the ones that are online. So trying to extrapolate that risk in looking at which ones have still yet to come online. So our 18 projects, 8 of them are on system and 10 of them are off system. But again, interconnection risk is really unique per project.
Corey, if you're trying to tease out the viability of the interconnection, I don't understand why you're looking at only what happened in the first 3 years, not the first 4 years before.
Sorry, Jake, I can't hear you.
I said that I think you just said that you were only looking at the 3-year period after contract execution and excluding the 4th year. But you were also saying that you were trying to tease out what the success rate was for interconnection locations. So I'm not sure I understand why you would exclude the full allowed time period for coming online in that context.
Are you saying why didn't I look at this for 4 years?
Yeah, or just whoever came online, whenever. But yeah.
Well, I mean, we can see the overall success rate, right, on that first slide. So the reason I focused on 3 years or less is because in our minds, that's what you're contractually committing to. Yes, there is a 1-year cure period, but our goal is that QFs don't need that and that you're achieving COD when you think you are. So that was my focus on the 3 years. We could look at this with a 4-year lens of how many come online with their cure, but I think the intent is that you come online on COD. So that's why I looked at it that way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, a contract is net of all of its provisions cumulatively. So, I mean, an RFP PPA that pays liquidated damages or uses any pre-extensions or negotiated extensions or whatever wouldn't be counted as a failure, even if it was, right?
Yeah. And these, I mean, the entire population of these are not failed because the population has everything that's online today. So they're all successful. I'm just looking at, of the ones that were online, how many were able to achieve that in 3 years per a standard contractor. So none of them failures.
Yeah, so I mean, I think for a lot of these things like that, where there's sort of logical variations, you know, that's a more meaningful policy thing to help inform the audience, which is obviously kind of why this was done. So those would be great to be able to see. It sounds like we might be.
The population on the left, average time between PPA execution and COD would capture any of those that took 4 years, or, you know, honestly, even longer, if there's litigation or whatever the case may be, to come online. It would, that number, the 2.5 and the 2.85, does capture those contracts as well. Irene?
Yeah, thank you. I apologize. I'm not following the connection between the coming online in 3 years and then average time between PP and execution and COD as tying that to interconnection risk. And please don't take this as an argumentative question. I'm missing the connection there. If you could, you probably said it, but I just didn't sink in.
Yeah, so a lot of the delays we see in our QFs are related to the interconnection process. So that's why I'm anchoring on this. It's just as like the point for interconnection risk is, are they able to achieve COD? Are they far enough along in the interconnection process, really? Because that's one of the main reasons we see delays here. So that's kind of like my tie-in.
Okay, I think this is making sense to me. So one of the main reasons why a project may not reach their COD is interconnection. And because of that, which is a reasonable assumption, then you're extrapolating, you know, okay, how many projects don't make it online in the 3 years, and tying that to interconnection. Okay, I understand. Sorry for missing that.
Nope.
Yeah, and while I think I understand that better too, I mean, that may be a quasi-reasonable proxy, but it's a pretty crude proxy, and notwithstanding all the interconnection issues that exist. But I think teasing that out better, and I know there's probably some cases in which you guys may know that or may not know that or what have you, but you know, in terms of like a policy backdrop that might be informing important discussions like PPA terms and things like that. I don't know. I get the sort of reasonable intention here, but it kind of misrepresents probably what's a different landscape. So that's probably something that should be revisited or not left as the final record on that.
Irene?
Yeah, I appreciate the way in which you guys are thinking about this. It would be nice to get a little more granularity of data in terms of maybe tying the projects to their interconnection agreements or the interconnection studies. You know, I know that it's not, that also is going to be a broad brush, but I think that this is a good way of starting to look at this, and there could be some more granular data that could provide some more light on it. So I appreciate the creative thinking that you guys have done here, but hopefully it'd be great if we can get some more information.
Well, yeah, and in time to that, I was going to make the same comment or similar comment later, but I mean, Corey's obviously, you know, done a good job scrubbing through data, and it sounds like there's naturally more than has been sort of tabulated for the strict stipulations. But I think, yeah, some of this stuff breaking out megawatts versus contracts, and you know, a little more of the sort of logical breakout that I think is inferred by Corey's analysis would be helpful, and figuring out what kind of, you know, just data set should be published so that, you know, stakeholders and staff could, you know, run their own summary charts and things like that on things would be a good idea.
Yeah, well, let me circle back up and see what we can provide. Irene, or old hand? Oh, old hand.
Sorry, thanks.
Okay, next slide. Okay, thanks. Okay, so give a little snapshot of this, but let me scroll real quick, but so the next part of the stipulation, actually want to just look at all those same 6 characteristics that we just looked at: interconnection risk, opportunities to sell to other utilities, etc. Or not QFs contracted, not yet online, but for our QF renewals. And I think, as I mentioned on a previous slide, answering question is that all of our that population of our QFs online or contracted, not yet online, none of them are renewals of previous contracts. So we don't have that history to run that same analysis on. And just to give a snapshot here, we don't really anticipate any renewals of QFs to occur any earlier than 2027, but that's only 6 megawatts, and you don't really see anything until post 2030 is when we start seeing higher volumes of potential renewals. So no big upcoming PPA end dates, if you will. So there is nothing really more on that, but also, like I mentioned, we do have a few QF contracts that did come to us from other utilities that came to PGE, but none of our existing QFs. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide.
Can we wait here, Corey? So I can think of a handful of projects that historically had contracts with PGE that have renewed. So it would be, I think there probably is some analysis that can be done here. And so there's, so I don't have all the information before me, but I do know, so for example, there's the Covanta Marion contract. There's, I think, Mindicree Hydro, and so there are a number of projects that we're selling to PGE, mostly very small projects, with the exception of Covanta, that have renewed or entered into subsequent contracts, or at least I thought they did. So I could be wrong here, but I thought there is a population of contracts.
So Covanta is like a really good example. And when I say there's no QF renewals, is like they don't re-renew as a QF. So Covanta was a QF, and when it renewed, it did not renew as a QF. So there are situations like that where it starts as a QF and it goes bilateral. So that's not include. So I don't consider that here. They didn't renew as a QF, so I didn't include that as a renewal. If that makes sense. But
okay, that's helpful. They are selling to PGE now, though, right?
That I'm gonna hold comment on at the moment.
Well, and I think what's interesting there, I mean, there's obviously a lot of things wrapped around kind of this potential data, but and I think it's just worth clarifying whether a facility that is a QF or is eligible to be a QF and certify as such under FERC is not the same as whether they sell under a mandatory purchase obligation contract. So in terms of the terminology and in terms of the policy issues, I mean, I think it still points to the value of a QF existing and so forth, because an example of a facility subsequently deciding to sell bilaterally, it therefore exists in the market, and clearly PGE found it beneficial to negotiate, or whoever that offtaker was, that's unclear, under a bilateral contract. But anyways, terminology wise, any facility that's under 80 megawatts, as well as some other hydro and cogen, are eligible to be QFs, whether they so certify or sell under a mandatory purchase agreement or not.
Yeah, I guess from the Renewable Energy Coalition's perspective, one of the main issues that they have been looking at in IRPs and avoided cost proceedings going back around 5 years or so is the renewal rate for existing projects, whether they continue to sell power to the utility. So this is kind of the main issue that they have been addressing years and years, and we were aware of there being a number of QF that had been selling to PGE, and I know that at least a couple of those are continuing to sell to PGE, and I had thought, I mean, I don't have any not any confidential information or anything like that, but I thought the Covanta Marion facility was continuing to operate at least. Maybe they're selling to somebody else, but I thought they were continuing to sell to PGE. So we would like to see an analysis that takes a look at QF renewals, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe that there's no QFs that have renewed, but at least at a minimum, there have been some QFs, and there should be a historic percentage of PGE's QFs that have renewed their contracts. So if PGE considers the Covanta Marion as no longer a QF, then at least they were a QF at one point, and for that first bullet, it should either be 100% or 0% for that type of facility.
And tying into that, I just think, there's, in terms of data completeness and coming to misleading conclusions or so forth, whatever's the sort of final production and analyses like that, those things need to have sufficient asterisks applied or footnotes to document cases where there's like materially, things like that type of case, like, oh, it was a QF, it's still selling. It's not selling under mandate purchase obligation, but it's still a QF selling to the utility. Probably shouldn't just disappear from data. Obviously recognizing, the scoping here that you're working under is what it was, but that would be logical from a sort of policy informing continuity perspective.
Yeah, we can definitely clarify that the scope was intended for QFs that are under contract with a Schedule 201 or 202, which is the population we're looking at.
Yeah, not necessarily, I don't want to argue that point now, but at a minimum, there were some QF contracts, and either they've renewed or they have not renewed. One way or another, those numbers should be reflected here.
Okay, I will take that as an action item and see what we can follow up with.
Yeah, thank you. And, on this part of it, I know we're going to go into the ELCC analyses, but I guess one thing that's coming to mind is to look at this and sort of what's in the data and not. And I think, I forget what the comment was, but definitely in these related discussions on this docket and in other dockets, the sort of AR 631, 2011, the discussion of well, PGE is relying on these things, as it relates failure rates, and what also conversely QFs are contributing or capable of contributing to the decarbonization goals. Obviously, HB 2021 had not passed last year when all this was stipulated, but as I'm looking at all this, I feel like one of the most important statistics that's sort of not here is what does all this add up to in terms of what PGE is, expecting, percentage-wise relative to its RPS and decarbonization obligations and its capacity needs. As there's several thousands of megawatts, but in some cases here we have numbers of facilities. It may take 3 facilities in the valley to equal a high desert solar facility, and so how much those are contributing to the megawatt hours of decarbonization contributions or RPS or et cetera, clean energy. Cumulatively, we should be able to see that. And also similar on the capacity front, if you have 669 megawatts of QFs that would be online, but they got, 3 to 17% capacity contribution on average, maybe that's, 60 megawatts or something. It'd be nice to see, to what extent they are contributing, could contribute, and or functionally maybe aren't being really relied on that much as relates how they should be treated or penalized or not penalized and things like that.
Yeah, so all of this data, Jake, just to remind you, is what was settled to in the UM 1728 docket last year. And none of those elements were a part of that stipulation, which is why they're not being showed here.
Yeah, understood. Just a lot of stakeholders, obviously this feeds in and relates to a lot of other parallel matters that intersect with this. But yeah, thank you.
Irene?
Yeah, to follow up, the stipulation said that it identified specific factors, including, but gave the ability to consider additional factors. Were there any additional factors that PGE considered including in this list?
Not at this time.
Thanks.
Okay, let's go ahead to the next slide. So this will maybe answer your question. So in the next section of this presentation, PG will be walking you through some of the ELCC modeling methodology that we have, as well as some of these potential ELCC sensitivities just for our solar portfolio. So case one of our sensitivities is going to look at the same thing that's online, plus the assumption that 100% of the contracts executed, not yet online, achieve COD. And then case two, we'll look at a D-rated that to the 49% success rate that we saw for solar on one of the first slides that I went over as a second sensitivity. And then the third is we basically did a middle ground between the two at 75%. And Irene, to your question of how do all of these, the 6 elements or whatever that we looked at, how does that impact, the sensitivity that we consider? And I don't think that there is a hard and fast math to that because there's a lot of fluctuation and deviation and uniqueness to it. But I think we can feel that based on things like sophistication, that we would expect trends higher than 49%. So we wanted to find something in the middle ground just to give you guys like a range of sensitivities that we would see. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tomas. Sorry, are there any other questions before I do that?
Yeah, thanks. So as I understand it, you looked at a high end, a more historic number, and then a more middle number, and you made a judgment call looking at one of the most important factors, which was sophistication of developers, and made a trying to not put too much values on this, but it seems like a reasonable starting point to say, well, if the developers are sophisticated, then that could move the number up. But other than kind of a broad kind of common sense sort of approach, you didn't try to weight any of the particular factors or identify how you might get to a different number other than that kind of reasonable common sense approach, at least to that one factor.
Yeah, there's no like formula, if you will, that got us to 75%. It's just, yeah, exactly as you described.
Okay, thanks. It might be useful to get a little more, and not necessarily now, but if there is any more thinking or process behind which of those factors you may think, well, these are not going to be factors in the future. So for example, if you think interconnection issues are not going to be as big of a deal in the future, then maybe that doesn't have as big of an impact. But if we could get a little more information on each of those factors as to why or why not you may think that trend is going to continue or not, that would be useful.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Tomas Morrissey. I'm an analyst in the PGE IRP team. And I'm going to walk through largely 3 different items today. First, we're going to talk a bit about how the Sequoia model, which we use for capacity, works. Then we're going to discuss the new solar profiles we're testing in this exercise, as well as, to some extent, the outage profile that the Sequoia model is seeing in 2025. And then finally, we're going to put it all together and talk about some ELCCs. Let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so the Sequoia model is an in-house hourly Monte Carlo adequacy model that we developed after the 2019 IRP. And it was developed largely to better model energy limited resources like batteries. And it's been used in various PGE processes and PUC processes, including the 2019 IRP update. The model targets a loss of load hour metric, or LOH metric, of 2.4 hours per year, and is incorporating PGE resources, owned and contracted resources, and then today we're also testing new proxy resources. The model also sees a market that's available. Currently, that market's available in all light load hours and also in spring and fall heavy load hours. And then lastly, as we're going to see on the next slide, the way the model works is for any specific year, and we're focusing on 2025 today. We're typically simulating 50,000 weeks to represent that year. So if we go to the next slide, we can see how those weeks are created. So the model doesn't necessarily need overlapping data to work. It creates what I like to think of as like these synthetic weeks. And the way it starts, it's going to randomly pick a week, so 7 sequential days. It doesn't have to start on Monday, out of history running from 1980 to 2020. And that's going to pass through some important variables to the next processes. The important variables are the month that it's picked, the load bin, and the load bin ranges from 1 to 5, with 1 being the lowest loads and 5 being the highest loads. And also the weekday. So is it a weekday like today, or is it a weekend? So using that information, the model first picks a hydro year. And in this example, picking hydro year 2003, and it knows that it's in August. So it says, okay, I'm in hydro year 2003, the month is August. And using that information, it knows a weekly energy budget for the larger hydro projects, as well as generation minimum and maximum parameters. And then a lot of the resources it's going to pull into the model after that, the next step, as well as the load, is going to pull in, again, based on those parameters. So for Big Low, it's one of our wind facilities, for example, it's going to be looking for a wind generation profile that occurred in August, and also in that first example, that first row, a load bin 5 day, so a high load day. It can go ahead and pick that for variable energy resources. It also does this to select load. With load, it also considers the weekday variable, as weekday versus weekend loads can vary in profile. And then other resources, like our thermal plants, are brought into the model more through monthly inputs. So it knows, okay, I'm in August, so this is my monthly max generation. And that can vary a bit in the winter due to higher air density. You can typically get a little bit more generation out of your thermal units. And those units also have a random force outage rate applied to them that differs by unit. So sometimes those units are available, sometimes they're offline. That was a lot of data really quickly. Any questions on this slide or the previous slide before we jump forward? Looks like you have a question. Go ahead.
Hey, Thomas, this is Ashwath from Renewable Northwest. A quick question on, the thermal aspect of the model. So based on HP 2021, I think there was talks about, creating emission limits for thermals. Has that been added to Sequoia, or are you working on it? What's just wanted to know.
Yeah, that's a good question. So for this exercise for your 2025, we don't have thermal limits modeled. Longer term, we are working with a consultancy to discuss how to bring in not necessarily thermal limits, but carbon limits into the model.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's work to do, basically, right? Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Other questions on the slide? All right, let's jump forward to the next one. So that was at a high level how the model sets up these 50,000 weeks. And then as it runs through its simulation, it will run into outages. So hours where load is greater than resources available. And when it does that, when it has an outage hour, it catalogs it. And at the end of running the 50,000 weeks, it will create a curve like this, where we're ranking the outage size. And larger outages go on the left side of the x-axis, the smaller ones on the right side. And then the model knows how many hours out of the 50,000 weeks, which I think is like over 8 million hours, are permissible to have an outage in to hit that 2.4 loss load hour target. And so it's going to walk along the x-axis until it hits that point, and it's going to go up until it hits this curve that it's created. And it's going to walk over to the left till it hits the y-axis. And that value tells us the amount of perfect capacity needed to bring the system to an annual 2.4 loss load hour target. Let's go to the next slide.
Does Sashwat have another question?
Oh, sorry. Saw that.
His hand's up. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Gonna unlower my hand.
Okay. Thank
No
you.
problem. Great. So when we estimate the capacity contribution of a new resource, we do the same simulation, but we're adding in that new resource. And the way the capacity contribution is estimated, it's as the numerator, the amount of perfect capacity that that resource is contributing. As the denominator, it's the nameplate capacity of that resource. So in this example, we've added that new resource. It's a 200 megawatt resource. We run the model again, and we get a new curve. And we again walk on the x-axis to that point that corresponds to 2.4 loss load hours per year. And we see where that curve is intersecting now. In this case, it's dropped down by 17 megawatts on the y-axis. So the numerator of the equation is going to be that 17 megawatts because that resource is the same as 17 megawatts of perfect capacity. The denominator is the 200 megawatts, which is the resource nameplate. And we arrive at a value of 8.5%. All right, let's jump forward to the next slide. This last one is just a reminder that all models are to some extent myopic. We are looking at the year 2025 in this exercise, but when we run this model and really a lot of models for the IRP, we're typically looking at a 20+ year horizon. And typically when I'm looking at a long range planning report, the first few years you can kind of see as a bit prescriptive. In the first few years, you have a fairly good grasp of what's going to be the loads and resources on your system, as well as the greater Northwest and Western interconnection. As you get further and further out, that gets fuzzier. So for example, if you were to look at the Power Council's recently released 2021 Power Plan, you can look at the first few years and that has some interesting information, but when you get out to year, say 2038, I read it more as a directional rather than a prescriptive plan. And again, I view that similar with Sequoia. The first few years are kind of like a roadmap, but as you get further and further out, it becomes more of a compass. That is the conclusion of our Sequoia slides. We're then going to jump into some new solar slides and talk a bit about what the model's seeing for outages. So any last questions on the model before we jump into this new material?
Yeah, Tomas, Jake with Lucen. I think following up on Sashwat's question, can you talk a little bit more about how PGE is planning to, and to some extent I would assume is already must be thinking very seriously about this given the 2030 HB 2021 milestone, but how are you looking at fossil constrained resources or runtime constrained resources, or and are you, and I heard something like trying to adapt the model, but have you started looking even at the cases of like what happens if we turn this one off? Obviously one of the cases is in the eventual cases that those things are zeros, not regular working units. So what is showing up in those, or have you run any interim test cases? How are you guys dealing with that?
It is still under development. And one thing I'll note, it's not like an individual unit target, it's a system target that we're hitting. So it's not necessarily specific to power plant X. But yeah, we currently have a contract with a consultancy to help us work through that. And we're hoping to be able to share more at a later date, but it's still under development.
What is that sort of later date timeline horizon looking like?
It really depends on the work with the consultancy and how that goes.
But you guys have your own, you're doing this in-house right now, or you have your own ability to run Sequoia cases, right?
It's an in-house model, that's correct.
Yeah, it just seems like drawing on my crude math major sort of view of modeling and programming, you know, you can define the endpoints of behaviors very simply by, you know, setting one or more things to 0, and then you can understand the model's behaviors of what goes where. So if port westward was turned to 0, then, you know, you get a new set of curves, et cetera, and you could go resource by resource and cumulatively, and, you know, with a handful of discrete cases can develop, I think, a pretty useful set of mapping of the nature and scale of the issues. Have you guys done that or at all, or is that something that you guys could run a select set of cases for to kind of help the world understand that better?
Yeah, again, we're working with a consultancy on it. I don't think we've done anything exactly like you specified, but we are, you know, actively running the model, the consultancy, to try to find good ways to define carbon limits in Sequoia and in the bigger IRP planning realm. We don't have anything shareable at the moment.
Okay. Is there any reason though you couldn't just run a case that turns off a single power plant and says that's not there, you know, proxies it for 0 fossil?
Again, it's not a plant by plant rule. It's a mass-based rule in the whole system. So I'm not sure that what we get out of that exercise. You know, maybe we'll eventually go in that direction, but we haven't tried that currently.
But right now, what you're doing is your exercises. You're saying if we add one more power plant, where does it shift the line? So you could say if we delete one more power plant, then the lines would shift too, right?
Yeah, if you take a power plant out, the system will become less adequate.
And then you would get a new curve for that situation that would inform, you know, what the shortfall need was, or, you know, all these curves. It seems like that would be, you know, useful and, you know, simple way to sort of start putting some bounds on these things, as well as looking at how much, for example, a solar facility contributes in a world where those plants aren't available, which is, I think, where we're going. Thanks.
Well, yeah, thanks for the comment. That's something to be able to look at. Any other questions or comments on the model? Jake, I think your hand is still up. Thanks. All right, let's jump forward and actually back one. There we go, perfect. So for this exercise, we are using 3 new solar proxy resources, and they're located in McMinnville, Oregon, Christmas Valley, and Wasco County, and their locations are shown here on this map. If we go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about these facilities. The physical facility characteristics are the same at all 3 sites, and we used a program called SAM, which is available through NREL, to create the shapes. And it's like an hourly performance model. And we're looking at solar profiles over 23 years. And the assumptions are inputs from the US Solar PV System Energy Storage Cost Benchmark report, which came out in January 2021. And again, the 3 sites are the same in terms of construction, but they do differ in geography, which will impact you know, cloud cover and other factors. Any questions on this before we move forward? All right, next slide, please. So before we dig into the shapes a little bit more, one thing we want to talk about is where the model is seeing outages. And so again, we're looking at year 2025, and these next 2 slides are going to use case 1, which is 100% of the QFs coming online that are contracted, plus all online QFs, without any additional solar resources. So no proxy resources have been entered yet. And this graph is showing on the y-axis a count of the outage hours by month. And in the winter, most of our outages occur in January and December, although we do get outages in February and November as well. In the summer, we're seeing the bulk of our outages occurring in August, although we are seeing some outages in September and July as well. And there's a couple tiny outages in some of the other months that don't really show up on this graph due to scale. Jake, question?
Yeah, thanks. So these outages are outages that are purely just due to capacity shortfall, not other system conditions, you know, line outages on things like that. Just clarify.
That's correct. Yeah, and it could be we do have hydro modeled with energy limits, so it could be that, we're running out of water in some of these weeks also. But yeah, generally speaking, this is a generation view of outages. It's not looking at the transmission system.
Okay, thanks. And then how would we convert this to sort of a megawatt scaled number of hours? These are single megawatt hours effectively, or what's the scale of this?
That's a good question. So this is a count. So whenever you have an outage, whether it be 1 megawatt or 1,000 megawatts, for these next two graphs, it counts as 1 outage hour. A different way to look at this would probably be with a box plot, which would look at the size of the outage, because they vary by outage. Some outages might be really small, and you're just getting clipped in 1 hour. Some outages might be really big, where you're having a larger outage over a long period of the day. This graph again is just showing an hourly count of when you have an hour out. So you could even have in this example, let's say you had an 8-hour outage, that would provide 8 different values to this graph, because it's per hour here, and it's not showing the magnitude though. That would be a different chart. It's something we could likely create. I'll have to double check on that, but this one's just looking at counts of outages.
Right, and I get that, but I think fellow modeling energy geek question though, did you look at like what the max is or any averages, or do you have any sense of, is there a 4,000 megawatt outage that versus the biggest one was 10 megawatts or 200 or anything?
That's a good question. We do have those data. The model produces that. And we definitely do have outages that are in the hundreds of megawatts. I can't give you like a mean or median value right now, because I don't know that off the top of my head, but that's something we could calculate.
Okay, thanks. And sorry, final question on that is, how do these numbers relate to historical situations? And I'm also, wondering kind of where that goes to sort of price and cost of outages. But like thinking back to, I think February of 2019, yeah, there was like an $800 megawatt hour a couple of days there with Mid-C. That seems like an expensive day.
Yeah.
Is that, how does that, is that an anomaly, or like, is this worse than before, better than before? How does this kind of shape up over time?
That's a good question. I don't believe we had an outage in Feb 2019, at least on PGE's system. Prices did get super high. Yeah, I think it touched 1,000 on the day ahead market. Real time prices though, day of, were a lot lower. That was a Monday trade. But yeah, as far as how this corresponds with prices, and we haven't really looked at that. That could be a fun thing to look at though, but we haven't tried to line this up with prices in any way.
Thanks. And then, sorry, if I could ask, this is a very interesting area, but how did you treat the future of hydro resources in this? And I know Bonneville's starting to look at some climate challenged cases and so forth.
Yeah, that's another really good question. So I guess 2 thoughts. One is, in 2025, we still have the majority of our hydro contracts online. That's one place where this differs, for example, from the 2019 IRP update. In that update in 2025, a lot of the Round Butte contracts were falling away, but we have since re-signed those. So this has a decent chunk of hydro for PGE. We are working with another consultancy. I hate to keep giving this answer, but we are working with another consultancy to discuss climate change and how we can incorporate climate change into our IRP process, and that might impact the number of hydro years we look at. And yeah, Bonneville is actively working on that as well. They're thinking about, and I don't want to speak for Bonneville, but maybe altering the way they look at hydro. And I think the 90-year hydro record might be available soon too. And I'm not sure that plays into Bonneville's decision. But it's something we will potentially be tweaking for the 2023 IRP, depending on our discussion with the consultant.
Okay, but right now, looking back to your earlier slide, you guys are just pulling random hydro
Yeah, it's historical right now, and it's going back in a pretty lengthy record.
Right. Thanks.
Great, let's jump forward to the next slide, please. All right, this is the same concept as the previous slide, but now we're digging into what hour the outages are occurring in. So the previous slide had months. This is looking at the summer and winter months, and here we're defining summer and winter, with summer being July, August, September, because that's when we see the most of our summertime outages, and winter being November through February, because that's when we see most of our wintertime outages. And it's looking at hour of day when the outage is occurring. So in the summer, we're highlighting in both in the different colors when we're seeing more than 500 hours of outage in the model. In the summer, we do see some outages starting earlier in the day, but they really start ramping up around hour ending 18. In the winter, we have more of a double hump shape where we see some morning outages, and it cools down a bit midday, and then it ramps up again considerably in the evening. All right, so let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please.
Jake,
Oh,
you have
we had a question, sorry.
Yeah. Jake?
I'll just put my hand down, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
So we're going to take a look at the next three slides. Average hourly capacity factors at these three proxy facilities. The first one's going to look at annual. The second one's going to focus, I think, on the winter months, unless I'm out of order. And then the last one will focus on the summer months. This is on an annual average basis. We see the Christmas Valley facility having the highest capacity factor, around 28%. The McMinnville facility at 22%, and the Wasco facility at 27%. One quick note, you'll notice that I've cut out the edges of the graph, as you typically don't get production, past hour ending 22 or before hour ending 4, and it's just done so it's easier to look at the graph. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is the same concept, but now we're focusing on the winter. And again, we're defining winter as November, December, January, February, as those are the months that we see most of our outages. And what I'm doing here in the blue is that's highlighting hours in which the model sees more than 500 outages. And in this case, Christmas Valley, at least under this view, is, relatively speaking, producing more power during those, well, the winter in general, and also during those higher outage hours. Let's go to the next one, please. This is the same concept, but now looking at summer. One warning here, we're defining summer as July, August, September. So if you were looking at like June, for example, which is, or May, probably your more sunniest months of the year, you might have higher values, but this is July, August, September, because that's when we tend to have most of our outages. On a capacity factor level, both Christmas Valley and Wasco up at 40% and McMinnville's at 35%. One interesting thing we saw, though, is as you get into the evening hours, so hour ending 18, 19, and 20, McMinnville starts performing, at least on a generation basis, slightly better than some of the other facilities. And we'll talk a bit about that on the next slide and why we think that might be going on. So we can jump forward there. And one thing we think might be happening, and there's a lot of factors with this, it's 23 different weather years, and cloud patterns probably play a large role, is McMinnville is also the westmost project. And while it might only be a few hundred miles west, it also gets a little bit more evening sun due to its western location. And so we're thinking maybe that's giving it a little bit of an edge in those waning evening hours in the summer. Similarly, Christmas Valley is the southernmost project, and in the winter that might be beneficial. If you're further south, you get longer days in the wintertime. We also see Christmas Valley performing best in the winter. Again, there's a lot of other factors that I'm sure come into this, but we just thought it was interesting that McMinnville is performing better. Again, like hour ending 18, 19, 20 in the July, August, September snapshot.
Tomas, I think those are good insights, and those are probably good explanators, whatever the right word is there. Ways of explaining that data behavior. I think obviously you guys picked a single case here, but this DC to AC ratio is still relatively low compared to a lot of what's going on. And for example, the 80 megawatts of QFs that were built in Christmas Valley vicinity and Harney County the last couple of years, those were all 1.5 DC to AC ratios. So just for the general group's benefit, those shoulder behaviors are going to be different, as a function of that. And obviously we're talking about QF stuff here, but presumably you guys care a lot about kind of how you're going to handle this decarbonization transition and deal with those capacity contributions. And so I would strongly recommend looking at those scenarios, all the way up to like 1.7, 1.8, even DC to AC ratios, and you'll get different sets of behaviors, and they'll favor different areas. They'll also probably juice your winter behaviors because like an average production in January is about 40% of nameplate across, all the days. But that's for, as you add DC to that, you push that up closer, you might end up at 60 or 70%. So there's a lot of other really meaningful behaviors as it relates to this. Finally, you take those same facilities and you add a battery to them, they're going to be clipping, as you point out in the summer days, that's an average across all those hours. That includes all the cloudy days. So 90% is a pretty high number, and means effectively, what we've seen in the data for a 1.5 facility is that, from maybe, 8 a.m. through 5 p.m., it's rock solid all day on a sunny day. And then you have some cloudy days that mix that up. But you start taking a battery that can, take some of the shaved energy and spread it out into the shoulder, then all of a sudden, it'd be pretty easy to, a couple hours of batteries to firm that up all the way through those red periods that you've identified. Thanks.
Yeah, we do see that in these projects as well. Perhaps not to the same extent, but they'll hit, like in a good sunny June day, they'll hit 100% and just stay there for a number of hours. In the 2019 IRP update, we looked at solar plus storage. We did not look at that for this exercise, though.
Yeah, and that behavior seeing where it's not quite as firm there, right? If all of the wobble and solar resources is happening in the clipped energy above the inverter rating, then you never see it because it's just clipped, as opposed to with a lower DC to AC ratio, those wobbles will show up a lot more. The closer you are to that 1-to-1 ratio, the more the wobbles will show up. At 1.5, you almost have 50% of nameplate that's just absorbed like in a shock absorption system, and so that stuff stays solid. That also helps with a lot of scheduling and stuff with Bonneville, which will become important since you have to schedule in megawatt increments too. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for the comment. All right, any other questions on this slide? The next few dive into the third chapter of this presentation, which is ELCC values. Great, well, let's jump forward to there. So again, we ran 3 different cases, and Corey walked through how we built those cases. Case 1 has the most solar in the system. It's the 100% QF success rate. At a system aggregate level in 2025, ballpark 1,200-ish megawatts of solar on the system, and most of that's coming from QFs or the large signed projects that PGE has. The next case we'll see, and we'll get there later, is that 49% success rate, and that's down to around 1,000 megawatts of solar for the total system. And the third case is in between at 75%. These are the 3 proxy resources run through that QF case 1. We see in the first 100 megawatt tranche, ELCC values around 5 to 6%, and then declining going forward. One thing to note about the decline, that's a decline in a percentage sense, not in a megawatt sense. So the amount of megawatts of capacity that are being reduced by these resources is always going up. It's just when you do the math and you divide the firm capacity into the nameplate, the percentage value you get from that equation is going down going forward. We can go ahead and move to the next slide, please. So this is case 2, and this is that 49% success rate. So there's roughly 180-ish less megawatts of solar on the system in this case out of the QF bucket. And we see higher ELCC values across the board. You're hovering around just over 8% in this case. And again, with that declining behavior going forward at the marginal level. If we go to the next slide, this is that third case at 75% success. and you're roughly in between the two. Christmas Valley is still up there around 8%. McMinnville is now around 6%, and Wasco just above 5%. But all the values are higher than they were in case 1, which is 100%, and then lower than they were in case 2, which is that 49% success rate. If you go to the next slide, it's the same information, but in a tabular form. This is more of a, if you want to take it home and look at it type slide. Looks like we have a comment on the chat. Irene, do you have a question? Okay,
I have a question about the QF sensitivities. I like to reserve some time at the end. I just wanted to note that. So no questions now.
Okay.
Thanks.
And
Tomas,
Jake, it looks like your hand's up.
Yeah, could you comment a little bit on, I guess, back to the DC to AC ratios? How did you guys end up with the 1.34 ratio?
That comes out, and I think we have Robert on the phone who put it together, but I believe it's coming out of an NREL report called U.S. Solar PV System and Energy Storage Cost Benchmark. And it's the report that came out in Jan 2021. Robert, is that correct?
That is correct. That that ties to that report. I believe that's also the sort of baseline assumption in the NREL annual technology baseline. They're kind of maybe it was like the moderate scenario assumption going forward. And so, yeah, Jake, to your earlier comments about testing those sensitivities around that inverter loading ratio, agree that would be probably interesting and is I guess relatively straightforward in the context of generating the data out of SAM, where it's maybe like a little bit more requires a little bit more sort of digging into the details, is developing those capital cost assumptions for various scenarios or different sort of component level costs that are not necessarily like available through the data sources that we've selected to use for IRP purposes, which is why we've kind of chose to use that, I guess, yeah, agreed, like somewhat generic kind of NREL number in this context. But yeah, I'll definitely take your comments and suggestions back.
Yeah, and I guess I'm not sure I fully follow the thread of what I think I hear there is we're going to use NREL's stuff for our future IRP, and that'll inform kind of what all goes into the IRP, which I may have other questions or concerns with because I haven't looked at that stuff. But look, the reality is the overwhelming lion's share of solar has been built in more southern, sunnier locations in the Northwest. This is you guys and the market is obviously starting to learn about these things, but the DC to AC ratio facility, optimizes on, a number of very specific, locationally specific, and some capital specific things, but you don't need CapEx to run an optimization or to determine the capacity contribution. Those things are completely independent. What it costs to build and how much it contributes are different. I guess I would just note, like in this context, I mean, I don't know how many dozen times that like stakeholders, including myself, pointed to higher DC to AC ratios, like thinking back to when we kind of had all these discussions and what's been going on in the capacity docket. So I guess it is a little surprising now, thinking a little further, that such a low DC to AC ratio was chosen. And I don't feel like, that is appropriate to inform QF policy or really good, system and resource management policy by PGE. Like the example I just gave on DC to AC ratios, the sun goes down so much earlier here and at such a lower angle in the Northwest that what's optimal for Arizona and Oregon are completely different things. And that, bears out. So you're going to always have a higher optimization towards higher DC to AC ratios in the Northwest, and your ability to serve those critical times are going to relate to that, which I guess also just means all of these numbers, capacity contributions, seem like they're necessarily extremely low. And so that's a general set of observations. I really feel like things should, be cases should be rerun with more realistic numbers, as we said back in those processes. And yeah.
Yeah, appreciate that comment. This is Seth. Again, I would say two things. First of all, there's an infinite number of combinations that we could evaluate, an infinite number of like technical specifications of the individual resource. But in the IRP, we are trying to get general proxy resources that give us a good enough flavor of the supply side to give a overall 20-year recommendation about what the quote optimal unquote resource build out would be. Now, again, we could get more specification by adding some more of those infinite number of combinations and technical specifications of the resource, but there's a loss of what else we would do, right? We're limited in our resources, and so we've always found that there is a balance in terms of proxy resource decisions, and we think we're trying to strike that right balance, and it's a judgment call, because if you look at this choice in isolation, you could always do better if this is the only thing we're focusing on. I would say that as one, and two, I would say that this is the reliance on NREL data is taken directly from suggestion from our participants in both the last IRP and UM 1728 docket to rely more on this publicly available data. And so we're doing that again to try to create these general realistic proxy resources that aren't looking at individual specific projects, but rather generalizations that we could get from the market.
Yeah. And look, I get that there's, you guys don't want to be doing the QF stuff. And so that's it, but look, as a professional that's been doing DC to AC ratio optimization for 15 years now, like that, it doesn't matter, like NREL optimizing whatever, when the 90% of the stuff has been built, several hundred miles south of here, the sun is just different in those locations. They're different answers. It is categorically a bad idea. You guys will be shorting yourself, your ratepayers, like the reliability of your system, if you do not take ownership of and run the DC to AC ratios. I called a consultant last week and I paid over $8,000, and we can run every single DC to AC ratio for a location from 1.25 to 1.7. It's not that hard. You guys need to know those answers to run your system. And so if you do know them and you've already done it and you're doing a good job, then it exists and it should be easy to share. If you haven't done it, you got to do it. Like, you cannot. Solar is the future of the reliability of your entire grid, and you guys are about to go through the most radical transformation in the history of the power industry. You need to look at those DC to AC ratios, and the answers are going to be a lot more like 1.567 than they are going to be 1.3. And those existing surplus DC to AC ratios are going to provide you the means to add batteries to those facilities later and solve capacity problems, which are going to be epic crises as well. Like, you just got to run those numbers, whether you hate the QF stuff or not. Like, it's a radical difference in behaviors and resources and future system costs, and you have to be the masters of that in order to do this decarbonization, and it's not hard. So it should happen in this docket, but one way or another, staff, as you're looking at this, it's not that hard, but it's very, very important. And finally, yes, thank you. I'm glad you're running the weather data over time. Yes, you should be using that. NREL's DC to AC ratio pick is functionally irrelevant for purposes of Pacific Northwest. So keep using broad data sets, but how to run the scenarios. Finally, you have all of our data. Like, we have projects, you have scheduled energy for facilities operating history, this very, very good data that shows the firmness of capacity in these things. So you also have that to draw from, and that shouldn't be omitted in how you guys are thinking about this.
Great. Well, thanks for the comment. Any other comments on the slide before we jump forward to the next one?
I think Brittany had a question.
I think I'm good for now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I think this is my last slide. We thought it'd be interesting for context to pull in different capacity contributions that other Northwest utilities have estimated. One grain of salt with these, or maybe a few grains of salt, is every utility profile and approach is likely going to be a little bit different. So people are going to use slightly different models, have different loads and load profiles and seasonalities, as well as different amounts of solar in their system. But we see a pretty wide range of results from different utilities in the Northwest. Avista in the 2021 IRP was around 2%. Idaho Power for a future standalone solar resource is around 10%. Northwestern recently updated some values with help from E3, and they saw values ranging from 12% down to 6%, depending on how much solar is being added. PacifiCorp had the highest values out of the utilities we looked at, and part of that might be that they're more of a summer peaking utility, and they're also using a different methodology to get to these values, using the CF method instead of an ELCC method. And lastly, Puget had values ranging from 8% down to 1%, depending on what order the resource is being put in and its location. Any questions? I think that is it for me. So we can go to the questions and discussion slide and see if we have other questions pertaining to this part of the presentation.
I'll jump in unless a little pause for anybody else. And I don't know who else has been thinking about the modeling aspects here, but I think combining the sort of earlier part of I think your presentation with the fossil resources and how we get to the curves for capacity contribution and the DC-to-AC ratio things, it really seems like the scenarios to start looking at how far do those numbers shift in a world that's fossil constrained. So my understanding of what we just heard is none of those models look at the case where fossil power plants are not available. And obviously, if we're looking at the capacity contribution in by 2030, those numbers would presumably shift materially if those units were constrained. So I think running some scenarios with that and also with the additional DC to AC ratios would make a lot of sense, especially as informs the policy front. Thanks.
Thanks. And just again, a reminder for the group, we're focusing on year 2025 for UM 1728. Next question, is another one on the phone.
Hey, Tomas, this is Sashwat again. Just thinking about, I think Jake or someone else mentioned, climate change scenarios with the 2021 power plant still fresh in the mind. Is there any possibility that you can get data from the Power Council and, maybe run a climate change, hydro and load scenarios? Because I think there have been a lot of reports which came out, I think, in a couple of years back or even last year that showed that, Pacific Northwest is moving towards summer peaking, summer peaking timeframes in this 2025 to 2030 timeframe. So I'm just wondering if that would be a good kind of sensitivity to run to just see what changes, climate change modeling can, how the climate change modeling can impact the capacity values of solar. Apart from the thermal limits, I think that's a major factor kind of driving, the capacity values. So, and the data is out there. The 2021 power plan is almost wrapped up. I'm sure the staff would be helpful in giving the data pertaining to PG's hydro fleet. So, yeah, I think that would be helpful. Thanks.
Thanks, Sashwat. Appreciate the question. So yes, absolutely. We think the incorporation of climate adaptation into the planning process is going to be important. We are, as Tomas alluded to before, we are working with a consultant right now to determine what the best way of doing that is. So while our load forecast historically has been adjusted, the weather inputs into it, that's only on the demand side. On the supply side, it's an interesting question. So what amounts of hydro can we expect both in, throughout the year? So spring, summer, especially with climate change, we expect loads to be higher in the summer, but we might have lower amounts of runoff. And so incorporating that into our into the planning process is going to be important. Now, we incorporate system characteristics, obviously, in a bunch of different ways in the IRP. And so one of the things we're asking the consultant to weigh in on is, what would be interesting to see as sort of a side sensitivity, right? So like, what happens if hydro does X, or what happens if load does Y, or whether this should be our reference case. In a more holistic incorporation of the planning into a more holistic incorporation of climate adaptation into the planning process, a la the Power Council. And so we are looking at that right now. We think it's going to be critical for this next IRP for us to weigh in on this, and an opportunity for us to set an example of the most appropriate way of doing that. And so we're really looking forward to that. That work is ongoing, and it will be reflected in the next IRP, whether it be, just something we look at on the side, or, full incorporation, like this is our reference case. And as you and others have said, this will directly go into resource adequacy. So again, both on the load and or demand and supply side, this will go in, as well as thermal availability. So that is another consultant we're engaging with, as Tomas again has alluded to, that is in development. We are working on this, and while we're not prepared to weigh in at this time, over the next year, that is a large focus of ours, and we'll be coming back to this group on the IRP side to talk a lot more about that going forward.
Thanks, sir. Thank
you. Seth, there were a bunch of things in there. I guess curious who the consultant is, and I guess what the marching orders or how those questions are being phrased. I mean, I was still a little shell-shocked from the HDR consultancy report, which that sort of, well, the consultant said so, became the answer we got to a lot of things for several years on that. So I guess I'll pause there. I have a follow-on question. Thanks. Who are the consultants, and how are they being directed to consider these cases? Like what's,
Yeah, absolutely. So mentioned two consultants there, one working on climate adaptation, and one on resource adequacy. And obviously in the Venn diagram, there's overlap. So E3 is the consultant we're working with right now on resource adequacy, specifically on Sequoia, and Creative Renewable Solutions is the consultant working on climate adaptation.
And then are you guys going to be, back to my question I was asking before about sort of quantifying the cost of the outages, how is that being examined, in that regard? Because obviously, like, which scenario you pick somewhat has to informs how much risk your ratepayers will be taking financially.
Sorry to interrupt. By quantification of outages, do you mean what the megawatt hour price would be in those outages?
Right. Well, it's going to cost something when you guys are short in some form or another, right? So, and, those days that you don't quite have outages, but the market pinches and the prices spike, and the days that you do have outages, those all cost somebody something. And so, I guess the basic question of which scenarios you choose are sort of have embedded in them a risk profile to your customers. So if you choose, if you choose a year that is not hydro constrained as the baseline, and we have a hydro constrained year and there's a big 1,000 megawatt outage and market prices spiked $1,000 a megawatt hour and hospitals don't have power and things like that, lots of bad things happen. How are you taking, what's the approach to quantifying the consequences of these capacity shortages? And how is that going to inform your selection of, treatment of weather years and ratepayer exposures?
So that's a really good question. Not the topic of discussion today. So we're not going to get into it right now, but agreed that between now and filing the next IRP, that needs to be discussed and hammered out.
It looks like we have a couple of hands still up. I'm not sure those are lingering hands or current hands.
Mine's not lingering.
Go ahead.
This is Brittany Andrus. Just trying not to have deja vu all over again with some of the questions and when they get resolved and how many times they might get iterated before they're etched in stone. So for example, choosing the proxy resources set, when in the IRP process is that going to occur? I feel like it would be great to have some milestones and know when they're coming. And then, instead of like, well, when we file the next IRP, because then it's too late.
We presented the list of resources that we are going to include in portfolio analysis in the November 2021 roundtable.
Well, yeah, I was just looking at the 2022. So that's not changed from then. So I guess we'll just submit comments, but so you're saying is that done? Is that up for discussion? Like at what, what's the iteration between stakeholders and PGE?
As Anne discussed earlier, we're happy to take feedback literally at any time in this process. But those are the ones, barring any significant changes between now and the filing of the next IRP, those are the ones that are going to be included in portfolio analysis.
So even though you're changing the model to accommodate climate change assumptions and changing the model potentially for other things, you're saying those inputs are pretty much fixed. I guess that's what it's hard for me to reconcile.
Well, I don't think the impacts of climate adaptation into our models is going to change the representation of the supply side from the market.
Other than hydro.
Hydro resources aren't incremental choices that we have.
But they are part of the base case, the reference case.
Yeah, so they will tell us. So let's think of the comically extreme scenario where all hydro goes away. The impact of that is the need increases.
Yeah,
so
I did that.
Right, but the supply side stays the same. So that where all hydro, evaporates or whatever, you have to procure more resources. But the selection set from which you draw those supply side resources doesn't change.
So I haven't looked lately. Are the comments received to date on the website now that were allowed to be public?
Good question.
It is active. It is active now, so you can go out right now and post your comments.
But the question was, so, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there were comments that we received before having this option of doing it through that form that Anne talked about earlier. I don't think we're posting those and our responses to them.
No, we're
but-
not. We're starting right now because
Right.
we didn't ask permission to publish. So the box, we are asking permission to publish, and we're starting it as of now.
That
on that.
said, if you had submitted something, say in like September of last year that you want published on the website and to have our response, just do it again, just like copy and paste it into
Well,
that form.
Frankly, I'm more interested in what I think Newsom is happy to share the portfolio requests and the other comments we put in, but I'm also interested in what other people have submitted. So I could go around individually and ask, hey, Sashwat, hey, Fred, hey, whoever. But I mean, I guess I'm looking for a more robust discussion, not just like, here's the PowerPoint and send in something and might or might not get a response within 2 months, or you know what I mean? So anyway, I'll leave it there, but you get what I'm saying.
And
Thanks.
for that point of what's public retroactively, I think PGE, like we understand the stakeholder process to be a public process. So if PGE is not publishing people's comments, which I wasn't aware of, then you should just contact everybody and say, please let us know if you wish your comments not to be published. But the stakeholders should have visibility to whether questions are being answered and asked and so forth.
I agree with the ends that you're driving at. We'll figure out the means and come back to you with an appropriate, because yeah, I mean, everything that folks are comfortable with being on the website should be there as well as our response. So we'll figure that out and come back to you.
In terms of hydro, when you mentioned BPA's contract is still online in 2025 for most of that, when does that phase out or go off? What is that threshold and what scale of issue is that? And it seems like we need to be running a 2030 case, especially now that, again, HB 2021 passed after this was stipulated here. But
so yeah, there's two questions. There's what are we doing for UM 1728, and then what are we doing for the IRP? And the capacity need in the IRP, we published the capacity need, going forward from today through the end of the analysis, say 2045 or whatever we choose. Those capacity need numbers are reflective of contracts rolling off. If that answers your question.
I guess, yeah, I can go dig that up. There's no like general rough scale of the answer as it relates to the BPA issue. And I mean, we're talking about what the modeling needs are and what new cases need to be run here. So it just sounds like a 2030 case needs to be run.
So we do evaluate the capacity need in 2030, and that is part of the value stream that we, produce.
And the capacity contribution of, the solar resources and so forth in a case that's out later, I guess is what I'm getting to. So I'm not sure what the follow-on here is, but obviously there's some sort of avoided cost update coming and so forth. So I think for us, pretty clearly, 2025 is usefulness as a year seems to have shifted a lot, especially since HB 2021 has passed, and it sounds like there's contracts that roll off, and definitely need some different DC to AC ratios as that were discussed, a year ago in terms of the cases before anything else is adopted.
Appreciate the comment. Again, this meeting is for the UM 1728 analyses, which we have presented the results for. We are getting close to the end of the time or at time, but I do want to provide Aaron the time he wanted for questions. Aaron, do you want to jump in now?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So one of the items in the agreement was that PGE was also going to review the historic percentage of QFs reaching completion and renewals for other utilities. I wanted to inquire about that information.
Sorry, on mute, I'm talking to myself. maybe our interpretation of that item was slightly different, but that was my intent of the comment that we have 2 QF facilities that came, like, are renewals, but came from other utilities.
Yeah, our understanding was that PGE was going to be reviewing the QFs that reach completion and the renewals for those other utilities. So I thought that language was pretty clear, that it's not looking at completion and renewals of projects coming to PGE, but the completion of renewals for other utilities. You know, for other utilities, how many completed, and for other utilities, how many renewed.
I can, maybe Aaron, correct me. I don't know how we, like, are you saying like basically give the equivalent of like PACS, like success rate, like their data, which we don't have access to?
Well, it's publicly available. I can provide it if you need it. You know, the idea is, that PGE does not have as many renewals as other utilities. I think there are some, but you know, so you don't have as many. And the idea was that this analysis may be quite limited given the smaller number of PGE QF renewals. And the whole purpose for this analysis is to come up with a reasonable estimate of how many of its QFs that are under contracts are going to renew. And one of the ways to do that was the list of analysis of PGE's renewals. But another way to do that is to look at the renewals for other utilities.
But yeah, that was not, sorry, that was not the interpretation that I had.
Okay, well, that we could continue the discussion later, but that's one of the things that we would like to see, because it's hard to get to a number to plug in there if we're not, if we're just looking at the PGE numbers. Okay, so sorry, go ahead.
You go ahead, Irene. I had some follow-ups about kind of the follow-ups.
Okay, so I just wanted to put a list of the items. You guys were probably taking notes, and I probably didn't take the best notes because I'm multitasking, but I wanted to identify some of the follow-ups that we had asked for, just to make sure that we're all, or at least they're out there. Additional detail on the reasons for the delayed COD related to interconnections was one item. Additional detail on the specific factors for each of the items and determining the specific percentage of QF sensitivities. So more information into each factor and why or why not that trend will continue. Are the large QF contracts confidential? My understanding is that the CSP projects are qualifying facilities. They still have to sell under PURPA. So I thought that there would be those included in the analysis, regardless of whether that's the baseline or not. I think an example of those would be useful. We also wanted to get, for existing QF renewals, you're going to go back and take a look to see if there's other existing projects, and we'd like to see that analysis or those numbers for QFs that have continued to sell under another transaction. And then we'd like to see the data supporting the conclusions to verify and run our own sensitivities. So whatever data that PGE relied upon, if you could provide that, that would be useful.
This is Erin from PGE. I think we can circle back internally, and then Irene, we can be in touch if we have any questions and kind of to talk about our perspective on this and then any next steps.
And I guess related to that, you know, there's sort of a wide range of possibilities here, but at a minimum, I think we need new DC to AC ratio cases run for these critical areas before any conclusions are drawn about capacity contributions. I guess I'll just ask bluntly, will PGE do that? I feel like we couldn't have stated it more clearly 9 months ago, and feels a little gaslit to be here 9 months later and then still be like, hey, and that's the wrong DC to AC ratio. So is that something you guys are going to do, or that we have to fight about? Or what, the IRP process seems like it doesn't really, we make recommendations and it's kind of just your sole discretion as to whether you're going to do it or not. So I'm just going to ask bluntly, can we get some different DC to AC ratios run that are more useful?
We appreciate the input. We will consider it internally. We can't commit to doing, you know, everything our participants ask of us. We'll certainly look at the issue.
Do you think there's something more important in the future of decarbonization than PGE understanding the behavior of solar facilities and how they're going to support their system and while they contribute to capacity? Like literally, I mean, just bluntly, the entire future of decarbonization is solar project performance, period. So you guys need to know how to do this. This isn't like some stakeholder has some goofball idea. This is the heart of the entire future. And so it's not something that's like a couple of years from now, if when a consultant says maybe based on a black box somewhere else, it needs to happen. And so it should just happen now. And we said this 9 months ago, and here we are 9 months later, and like, oh, need higher DC to AC ratios, and oh, well, we'll take your input into consideration. It's the response.
I think getting a general characterization of the capacity contribution of solar resources is an important part of the IRP. What amount of specificity we dive into and the sources of the data that we use is a judgment call, and we will make that judgment call for the filing of the next IRP.
So I hear that as a no. I don't know if anybody understands that differently. I would recommend a single, slightly higher than probably is optimal case, like 1.55 or 6 case be run at a minimum. Ideally, there would be, you know, like a 1.5 and 1.7 would be another alternative with 2 sizing ratios, but at least one higher case, which would provide some sort of reference higher case scenario to get a sense of the contribution dynamics. I think as stakeholders, we would view this DC to AC ratio is inadequate or incompetent to represent the capacity contributions of facilities for these purposes. So we're happy to discuss practical accommodations, but you know, we built DC to AC ratios on your system, and you guys are just ignoring what those are as you're using your proxy resources here. So I don't. Happy to discuss practical accommodations, but we need to get to like a real useful, relevant answer.
Appreciate the point. Again, I would reiterate, these are general proxy resources. We're going to not have the, you know, the total possibility of all inverter ratios on our portfolio analysis. And so we have to make generalizations, and we will consider looking at this further. You can't commit to making any changes right now.
All right, that's
so could I just
choosing an out-of-date heat rate for a power plant or something, where we're just going to assume a 10,000 heat rate for a combustion turbine or combined cycle or something. It's not. I'm for the sake of clarity reiterating, we're not asking you to run every single case in the entire universe. Although for $8,000 you can have it, and I'd be happy to give you $8,000 if it would help solve that problem. But we're asking for one single relevant, competent case as the proxy resource, not something that's out of date, improbable, associated with different geographies, irrelevant, and inconsistent with the off-system resources that have been built currently to the PGE system, which are currently operating, which you also have data. So this isn't, we're not This isn't conflating some highfalutin 50 scenario thing. We're just asking for a good, solid single case or a practical discussion of the right competent proxy resources, period.
Brittany, were you
Well, I just wanted to follow a couple things. So Irene asked for the data for the QF assumptions, I think, and I just wanted to clarify that hopefully we could also get the solar profile that was used for the ELCC calculations. And I guess just when you guys converse with Irene, if you could, get back to the rest of us as well on those items. And yeah, also I did send in the chat the screenshot from the resource list, and it doesn't even list the DC AC ratios. So I guess that's an example of where I wasn't clear that those things were being chosen and put into the models as a starting point. I'm thinking in the PAC paradigm, which I know is not always fair, but they do provide a whole list of all the assumptions that go into their resources. And so I'm hoping we can get something more like that and actually be able to discuss it in the IRP roundtables.
Yeah, appreciate the point. So for the resources that we are including, we could provide directions to produce those in SAM, or we can just provide the data themselves to you, whichever is easier for you.
I want what menu of resources is PGE including and what are their characteristics when you're putting in your resource choices into Sequoia. I want it for all the, I could send you the table out of the PAC IRP.
I understand what you're referring. Like I said, we can provide the inputs to Sequoia for each of the proxy resources, or we could provide the instructions how to generate them yourself using SAM.
So Seth, I'm not just talking about solar for one thing.
I understand.
Okay, so I guess we'll put it in a comment. I will list out the characteristics that I believe the public discussion should involve when it comes to the characteristics of these resources. Thanks.
So tying back to my question, when will you guys provide an answer to stakeholders and staff on whether you will be running another DC to AC ratio for these cases? Can we get a fixed date? I just want to make sure this isn't like months into a black hole until we find out no. Is that something you can answer in the next 2 weeks?
Are you asking about UM 1728 or the next IRP?
Both.
Okay. I don't know. We have to talk about this internally and get back to you.
All right. I guess staff, we would like some clear decision points so we can discuss if there's an issue with the decision and have that be known. I think our big concern with the IRP related processes, and it's obviously super relevant to UM 1728 for pricing, is in this case, making suggestions and then not finding out when or if they're adopted. And this is pretty consequential. So a discrete timeline to having an answer on this would be appreciated if you can facilitate that. Thanks.
Any other questions or comments for us? Hearing none, I will turn it back over to Ann.
Thank you, Seth. And thank you everybody for participating today in the March Roundtable. Our next Roundtable will be April 14th, and you can find that information online on our website. I want to remind you again about the stakeholder feedback that we would like to hear from you. And again, we're just starting sharing this information. So if you have a comment or you have questions, that you can ask again, even if it's been answered before, if you want it to be published, go ahead and put it out there and fill out the form for us. And we'll be happy to respond. And as always, you can contact us through the IRP mailbox at irp@pgn.com. So thank you again for everybody for participating today. We'll see you next month.